Hello again, and I think we're ready to start our second part of the evening, the discussion. I hope you enjoyed the performance. I thought it was wonderful, and I'm sure we'll hear from all the speakers what they how they found it as well. And I'll introduce our chair, Lucy Ash, correspondent with the BBC, who will introduce in turn our speakers tonight.
Okay, great. Do I need to have this actually if I've got this other microphone? No. Okay. But later on when we do the questions, if people could wait till the mic comes to them, because I think we're streaming this and it would be nice for your questions not to be off mic. So yeah, I'm sure you'll agree. I think that was a really cracking show, brilliantly acted, beautifully written, and tells you an awful lot about what's going on in Russia today. I just want to say quickly before I introduce the panel that actually I'd seen one bit of it, which was the last scene between the lover, the husband and the wife. On Valentine's Day last year in Moscow, John was there as well.
That was appropriate, I didn't think of that.
It was Valentine's Day. And it was at the grand reopening of Theatre Doc, which is perhaps Russia's most controversial theatre company, the smallest and the noisiest, other epithets it's gained. And it had been turfed out of the premises that it had been in for 12 years, just sort of around New Year's Eve, because it put on a screening of a play about the conflict in Ukraine, and the audience were all made to stand outside in the courtyard in -15 for a few hours. And then Moscow City Council that owned the building said that they had to leave. So they found this other beautiful 18th century building in eastern Moscow near Baumanskaya. And when I arrived, I was really touched, because what was quite exciting about the opening night is that they were still trying to get the theatre ready. But there were so many volunteers, actors, directors, the architect, but also lots of members of the audience. And people had been working there for weeks, bringing sandwiches, bringing soup for the builders. And it really felt like it was a big group thing. And of course, there were far too many people trying to get in for the opening night show. There were people trying to sit on strangers' laps. There were people on the windowsills, hanging off the ceiling. But it was a really kind of amazing sort of outpouring of emotion and pride in the very exciting new writing that's going on in Russian theatre. But then they, less than 6 months later, they were forced to move again, this time because they put on a play about the Bolotnaya Square protest. Some activists that had been at that demonstration just on the eve of Putin's return to the presidency for the third time. And Yelena Gremina, the director of theatre, was saying she thought it was very important not to forget in everything that was being talked about in the conflict with Ukraine and Crimea, that these people had been sitting in prison and that their lives had been wrecked and their families' lives had been wrecked. So at the dress rehearsal, some police turned up, and then even though they had a private landlord for this new beautiful 18th century building, they got moved on again. So basically all this is to say that Russian theatre is in a very vibrant state. There's some brilliant talent, but it's under quite a lot of pressure. And that's one of the things we want to talk about tonight. So I'm just going to introduce the panel. So Noah Birksted-Breen is the artistic director of Sputnik, which puts on new Russian drama for British audiences. And he's responsible for not just this festival and other festivals, but he's also a playwright in his own right, a director and a translator. And I have to say that I think your ear for street Russian, for slang, is unparalleled. It's really great. John Friedman has been living in Moscow since sort of perestroika times in the late 80s. He's kind of a walking encyclopedia of everything to do with Russia and the theatre. His reviews in the Moscow Times for decades kind of alerted everybody to what was really worth seeing on stage in Moscow. And Simon Stokes is in partnership with Noah's Sputnik Theatre company, and he is the artistic director of the Theatre Royal in Plymouth, which is actually two theatres. There's a big theatre that puts on musicals and stuff that makes a lot of money, and then there's a theatre, which isn't a bad thing, and then there's a theatre called the Drum, which puts on amazing work, and it's one of the most exciting theatres in the UK. Maybe I'll just start with you, if that's okay, because I'm quite interested in why a theatre in southwest England partners up with Noah, and what is it that excites you about Russian drama now?
Well, I have to say the theatre that makes a lot of money actually pays for stuff like this, which is a good thing. When I went to Plymouth, I used to run a theatre actually with Jenny Topper here in London, in West London, not far away from here. When I went to Plymouth, having worked in various places, including in the West End here, I said that if I was going to get a reputation in new plays, and I am a new play theatre person, other people do Shakespeare and other old plays, I'm a new play specialist. I said that if I was to get Plymouth a national reputation, which is our purpose, in order to have a local reputation to begin with, I would need to get a national reputation. And now I believe that in order to maintain a national reputation, we need to have an international reputation. And part of our program is internationalists. I work with a number of companies from Europe and so on. I facilitated Noah's work with, in combination with Queen Mary University, in which we plotted with Noah to do the translation of these 4 plays. Not many Russian plays are translated into English, and we wanted, first of all, to add to that canon and to be introduced to certain writers. But I have some knowledge myself of Russian theatre, not as much as some on the panel, but I also was at Theatre Doc in, I guess, about 12 or 15 years ago. I did a little work with some of their writers. They facilitated that. I did some workshops, met a number of people, and I am familiar with the work of some of the Moscow theatrical personages, and indeed people from St. Petersburg and elsewhere. I don't know vast amounts about Russian theatre, but I know some of the key themes and thinking. And in fact, the play that we did 2 days ago, which is called Zhana, my then partner, as the performance is ongoing, is still playing it in Moscow. So I am obviously looking to see what can be done in this country. Could any of these plays be done in this country? Could I commission certain writers, if necessary?
Well, no, obviously a lot of the themes that have been exposed in the plays this week are quite universal ones. I've seen Jana, which talks quite a lot about, the corrupting influence of money and the relationship between the sexes and that. When you came to choose the plays for this festival, what was your guide? I mean, how did you go about selecting?
Sure. I mean, I think the joy of doing 4 plays together as readings is that you can choose very different types of work, different subjects, different styles, and present different perspectives on Russia, but also on Russian theatre at the moment. And I think that was always the aim. I think it'd be disappointing, because a lot of people, obviously, as we were saying, have come for a few nights here. And it'd be disappointing, I think, if people came and there was all exactly the same type of play. And it wouldn't represent Russian theatre at all, or Russia for that matter. So, I mean, I have a great love of documentary theatre. It's not the only theatre that I'm interested in, but I do love it. So there were 2 documentary plays that I was very interested in. One is this iconic work, Doctor, which has never been done in this country, and Grandchildren as well, which we presented. And I mean, I also recognise that they're culturally very specific, and it would be difficult to produce those in this country. But I feel that nevertheless, in a way, that's the joy of presenting them here, that there is an audience, and obviously you being here testifies to that, and as well as the audience who were there those evenings. On the other hand, Jeanne and the play tonight are fictional works that engage with the contemporary realities in a way that's much more accessible to audiences who don't know anything about Russia. So I think we really wanted to get all of those sides of contemporary playwriting into this festival.
In the play we saw tonight, there are some moments that are very comic, and there's some very dark moments, some horrific moments. What does the title mean to you? The war hasn't yet started.
Yeah, I think he's describing. Well, there was the Presnikov brothers wrote that play Terrorism some years ago, and it was staged, and that was all about how terrorism, of course, is a criminal activity, but it's also something that exists inside us all, or potentially exists inside us all, to create violence to others in different settings, in the workplace, in the domestic settings. And I think this is a kind of similar type of play in that sense. I mean, it's quite different artistically in its form, although actually there are some similarities. There's quite a fragmented play as well, and it's that similar type of project as an artistic project. It's about what is war. It's not war, of course, is that activity where people attack each other, but it's also begins somewhere else. It begins in that sort of psychic state and paranoia in the time when people can't quite distinguish the reality from their imagination, whether that's because they're being lied to through propaganda or whatever reasons those are. But I think it really cleverly explores that. I'm not a huge fan of high concept plays, but I think this one works because it still gives you all the characters. You can still go deep into those characters, even in a short space of time, and it still has that really insightful intellectual project within it beyond the sort of high concepts of the form. There's an overall sort of intellectual project which binds it together. So I think it's about sort of documenting Russia in a fictional form, which is sort of really on the brink of a very catastrophic place politically and culturally.
There's a kind of, John, there's a kind of hunger to embrace lies in a way in the scene with the journalist that comes home.
Yeah.
There's some quite kind of close parallels to what's actually been going on. I'm thinking of the story that was on the Russian TV about the 3-year-old boy in Slavyansk who was allegedly crucified for speaking Russian in a town where most people speak Russian. I mean, totally crazy stuff. And you were saying to me earlier on that almost every day in Russia at the moment, there are moments where you do a double take and you think, can that really have happened?
No.
Did you feel that this play captured that mood?
Parts of this play captured that really well, and particularly the conversation between the journalist and her husband. I was shaking my head as I listened to that, because I was thinking, I'll just go straight to reality. I was thinking about a protest that my wife and I attended. It was a peaceful protest. There wasn't anything going on whatsoever. There was a lot of people, but nothing was happening. But there were police everywhere, and there were paddy wagons everywhere ready to haul people off. The gathering was extremely peaceful, no problems whatsoever. And there is one of the worst television stations in Russia and in Moscow is called NTV. And their camera crew was sitting over at the side with the cowls on the cameras. And the guys sitting there smoking and waiting. And I mean, there's 35,000 people out there peacefully demonstrating and meeting, and the NTV is not shooting. And so my wife, who is an actress, she's a well-known actress, and she's being an actress, she's not afraid of saying things publicly. She walked up to them, and she said, "What are you guys doing?" And they said, "Well, we're just taking a rest." And she said, "Well, why aren't you shooting? What's going on? This is the news today. Don't you know that? This is the news. There's 35,000 people out here peacefully demonstrating, and you're not filming it. Why aren't you filming it? Are you waiting for something to happen to shoot?" And they go, "Oh, don't worry about it. Well, this is just our job." "Oh, it's just your job. It's just your job. What, did you ever think about getting a different job?" She said, "No." She just. She does this all the time. I stand by and I love it. I mean, seriously, she does it all the time. Being a well-known person, she gets calls all the time to appear on television. She refuses to appear on Channel 1, on MTV, and other channels. She refuses to let her face be part of what is going on. But they are constantly trying to get her. They're trying, no, well, there will be no politics in this thing, Oksana. She says, and she will start talking to the person calling. Do you know what kind of station you work for? Have you thought about getting another job? And she does this all the time. It's wonderful. But the fact of the matter is, to cut to the chase here, which was literally a chase, the authorities decided at some point they didn't want this to happen anymore, and they started chasing after people. And of course, when police chase, people run. I mean, it wasn't a case of people running and then the police started running after them. The police started chasing after people, and people then started to run. And the MTV camera guys jumped up, pulled the cowls off and started filming, all the nasty people who were having to run away from the police. So, I mean, that's that scene from the play is absolutely, positively a realistic kind of thing. I mean, these kinds of things, we hear them all the time. The channel, NTV or Channel 1 are telling stories, reporting stories that turn out that evening or the next day to be lies. They turn out to be untrue. And I'm not even talking about the things that they just make up. I'm talking now about, what is even worse. They hear something, grab on it because it sounds good for them. They throw it out in the air, and then afterwards they don't bother to check it, pick it up, or anything else. So, those scenes are from the play are extremely realistic. I would just say, I'm going to say this briefly because we may not come back to this topic, but there was also the lovely scene about, how can you go to a peace demonstration where our enemy's flag is flying? And this is a wonderful thing too. Indeed, in Moscow is, Russia is at war with Ukraine, and you go to a peace rally and the Ukrainian flag is everywhere. And it's a bizarre, I mean, these are double take moments.
Well, the idea of burning a flag in the name of peace is quite a strange one.
Well, yeah, but just the fact, just the very fact that these flags are there, and I invited, my wife was taking part in one of these. It was a huge rally. It was called a Peace March, and she said, "Can we get some more theater people there? They want some more theater people, and not politicians." So I got Maxim Kurishkin. I called Maxim Kurishkin, who is a Ukrainian playwright, lives in Russia. Max doesn't like, he's a stutterer. He doesn't really like to perform, but he understood that as a Ukrainian living in Moscow, living in Russia, that this was something he could not, just for his biography, for himself, for the Mirror in the morning, he could not say no to me. I usually don't force his hand that way, but I did this time. And he came, and unfortunately the punchline isn't going to work here, because he got up and he recited an entire scene from his greatest play, which is called Kitchen, which is a play about war, lack of memory, historical memory. I mean, I can't do any more with Kitchen right now. I mean, it is a huge Shakespearean kind of play. And there is a scene in it in which one of the characters is yelling at the Nibelungs, because there are contemporary Russians and Nibelungs in the same play, in this Kitchen, and is shouting at the Nibelungs, "You don't know who you are, Nibelungs!" And here's Maxim Kurishkin standing on a stage in front of 50,000 Muscovites, shouting at them, "You Nibelungs, you don't know." I mean, it was an astonishing, I mean, I will tell you, I stood there and cried. I don't think any but myself and my wife understood what was happening, and Max. And a couple other people. There were a few directors there, I'll talk to later. It was an astonishing moment. And Russia is giving us the opportunities for these astonishing moments all the time right now.
What kind of opportunities do you think, Noah, the current climate provides for playwrights? Do you think it's a source of inspiration, this sense of the absurd quite often? I mean, the absurdist implant we heard about, but you know, the disconnect between what we see on television, what's reported, what's happening, all these different competing versions of the truth. Is that a good thing for playwriting?
Well, there's no doubt that it's an additional motivation to those who want to express themselves artistically, and of course that spurs them on. But actually, I mean, sorry to slightly dodge the question and answer something else that I find interesting about this project, slightly sort of unique, is that, of course, this play was commissioned by a Scottish theatre company, and it's quite different to the work the playwright normally does. Not very different, but it has a different flavour. It generally goes for traditional narratives. Perhaps there's one play where that's not quite the case, but generally. And something about the sort of cross-cultural collaboration I think is fascinating. He perhaps felt freer. Well, he said it himself, really, that he felt freer to express himself in a different way and maybe engage with themes that he wouldn't have felt he could engage with, perhaps even at all, but sort of theatrically in a different way too, that it inspired him, the thought this was going on in a different country. So that has been a sort of, maybe in this particular project, an additional stimulus. But,
the style of theatre doc is very much verbatim theatre, you know, which seemed to a lot of Moscow audiences very bizarre. You know, if you've been brought up on going to traditional productions of Chekhov, or even if you'd been to, you know, some of Lyubimov's groundbreaking productions at the Taganka Theatre sort of in the 80s. Some people were saying, but can this really be theatre? It's just people kind of standing around chatting. And how do you sort of, was that something that you thought was interesting for audiences here, to sort of see a slice of real Russian life?
Well, it is interesting. I think it was when Theatre Doc was introducing that form and that kind of material, which was foreign to them. It was pretty interesting and remains interesting in Russia too. But things are fluid and have been moving over the past 20 years, I think, theatrically. In this play, for instance, it's very interesting to me because I think there is a tradition.
Everything you needed to, you've done extremely well, and you don't need more than the first year's funding, for example. And then, of course, again, I saw a few shocked faces out there, so I mean, I can tell that maybe there are at least some people who don't know everything about this. That just to state that there was the law in 2014 banning swearing in any live performance or film or novel or literature. Although it seems that so far, I don't think anyone's come to court.
One of the things I love about Russia is that nobody pays any attention to the laws.
I mean, they could have closed down Theatre Doc by now if they'd wanted to on that law. So clearly, you know, in some regards, the authorities still has decided that Theatre Doc is allowed to exist for the moment, but it could be used.
But I mean, I think we're going to open up the floor to questions now, but I think even plays in big theatres like the production, Kostya Bogomolov's one of An Ideal Husband, very loosely based on Oscar Wilde, but quite a sort of quite savage kind of parody of some of the stuff going on in Kremlin circles. They don't actually say swear words, but it manages to be much more obscene. I don't, so I mean, maybe, you know, it's kind of stimulating, some people would say, to have these zapret, sort of, what do you call it?
Bans.
I have just remembered a very funny thing that Elena Gremina said. I think it's funny. She talked about, because of course she's sort of in some ways looked up to as the political playwright in Russia, or at least one of them. Very usually documentary plays, and she's at some points a few years ago sort of said, you know, I've done all these documentary plays, and I would just love to do a historical play. But, you know, certain events have happened, and I'm going to have to do another documentary political play now. It's a sort of a duty in a way. In fact, she did get around to doing
She's doing several
plays,
now.
which is great.
Yeah.
But
She's done several.
Can we kick off our questions from a question here in the back, Jenny Tobber?
On Tuesday, the first evening of this week's theatre readings and discussions, we had a play called Doctor with the subtitle, I think, if I remember correctly, Stories of a Provincial Doctor. And I find myself, whether the discussion we're having here now is about theatre principally in Moscow, perhaps in St. Petersburg as well. What's going on outside in that vast country called Russia? I find myself thinking about, for example, at a time when the United Kingdom seemed a bit more united than it does now, we had, for example, a company called 784, which came out of Scotland, which was very, very precise in its views of the predominantly capitalistic state that we lived in and we live in. And I wonder whether there are Bruits from abroad, as it were. Are there little pockets, are there fringe companies who set up outside of Moscow or St. Petersburg and somehow find themselves fighting their good fight? Or yes, I'd like to know more. I'd like to know more about what's going on outside of those two centres.
I'll say something, but I mean, I'm sure you have something to say about that as well. But I mean, I rely a lot actually on the work of critics to know what's going on. And there's a excellent critic called Pavel Rudnev, who's written about this. So I'm really quoting him when I say this. But actually, as I say that, I think him and also Elena Kowalska. But anyway, and there's a note of hope here actually, because Moscow is very different, and in a lot of regional theatres. In a way, unlike in Moscow, at least the smaller stages are being used for to promote the work of contemporary playwrights, and almost so in some ways, contemporary playwriting, you could argue, is doing better regionally than elsewhere. Also, and this is definitely Rudnev was talking about. He talked about decanonization of Russian theatre. That in the last 4 or 5 years. You no longer could only look to Moscow and St. Petersburg for really distinctive original work, and that's talking about the work of directors as well as playwrights. But now that's happening in at least some major cities across Russia, and that was partly what sort of stimulated the Novosibirsk debacle, where someone had created a very racy classical opera with a figure of Jesus, I think, naked and whatever was happening on stage. Apparently very brilliant production, but of course the Russian Orthodox Church in Novosibirsk didn't really like it. But so I think there is a note of hope there. The only thing is that in terms of playwriting, which is my sort of concern, the new writing, there are when the regional theatres do stage work, it tends to always have come originally from only a very small number of places, and generally speaking that's only 2 places, Theatre Doc in Moscow and the Kolyada Theatre in Yekaterinburg, which runs a festival. So these are really the 2 heroes of contemporary Russian playwriting, in my view, is those 2 places, although it is good that regional venues are taking the initiative at least to stage them and engage with the idea of the importance of contemporary playwriting.
And they got some support from the Royal Court, didn't they, in Yekaterinburg?
In Yekaterinburg. I don't know about that actually. I think it was more in Moscow, as far as I know.
It was the president. It was the president. It was the president's party that gave them money to build their theater.
Right.
I don't know about the Royal Court being there. I don't think so. This was one of the things that made Nikolai Kolyada go from being on the side of the opposition. When the president gave him money for his new theater, he quickly switched over and started supporting Putin before the election. I don't believe the Royal Court was there.
I think the Royal Court, though, have picked up the plays of Sigarev and the Presnikov brothers, who are connected, obviously, with Catherine.
The connection came through Moscow.
Right. Okay.
Yes.
They found the plays in Moscow.
Yes.
Okay.
I'm glad you made that comment. That's true. Yeah, Sigarev, of course, and of course Sigarev in England is well known among at least among the cognoscenti. You don't realize how big of a question you asked. Your question is as big. Your question is as big as Russia. Noel, you wouldn't have asked that question here this late if you really knew. This is terrible because you can't do justice to that question. But there must be a few things said. One is, if you're interested in this topic, indeed, read Pavel Rudnev. And he writes occasionally in English. His English is quite good. And if you can't read him, then next time invite Pavel Rudnev, because Pasha Rudnev is very knowledgeable, and he has made it his mission to go out and support and lift up what so-called provincial theater in the provinces. So that's one place you can go to find some more. Look up Pavel Rudnev and find the stuff that he may have written in English. Tannhäuser, which was in Novosibirsk, the one that ran into trouble, with the controversial Jesus thing. You have to be a little bit careful because the libretto for that was written by a Moscow critic who set that theater up to do that show. So the impulse was coming from Moscow. The noise was made in the provinces. It's important, that's important, but it was a Moscow-generated thing. The other thing I do want to say that in the last couple of months, well, last couple of years, directors have stopped trying to find positions in Moscow and St. Petersburg, and they're going out into the provinces to make their reputation. There's a lot of people that have done that. Many have gone and stayed and have become nationally known. Some go, make their reputation there, come back to Moscow or come back to St. Petersburg already as known quantities. Excuse me. So it indeed is it's a changing thing. That was not true 5 years ago. It is now true. So that's in flux.
Any other people? Yeah? Could you just wait till the microphone comes? Yeah.
Thank you.
If you could just introduce yourself.
Well, my name is Bill Keenan. I represent myself. I was here on Wednesday for Jeanne. I missed the other two, but keeping my ears open, I've been hearing very good things about them. Very powerful pieces, extraordinary quality of drama. Very well rendered into English, very effectively, and beautifully performed. Now, they all have things to say, to reveal to Western audiences about Russia, how she is today, and how her people are, and how they relate to each other, and so on and so forth. My question is this: what plans have you, or what plans do you plan to have to bring these to fruition on stage, or, dare I ask, on radio?
Yes, it's a good point, if I may just talk about it is something I'm looking at the moment with these plays. I mean, we are very fortunate to have entered already into this conspiracy with the Frontline Club, who also are looking, obviously their purpose is to look outwards, and they are internationalist, and so are we. There is a question for me. It is interesting, the radio question, as to what would work and what wouldn't work. And I'm trying to evaluate the plays as we have seen them over the past 4 days. I mean, one play that we haven't talked about much is Grandchildren. I talked with one of the authors of that, Mikhail, and he wrote, this is a play, in brief, simply about the circle of Stalin, the grandchildren of that generation and that circle, and who very often are part of the middle classes now in Russia, in Moscow in particular, and they, with some difficulty, sometimes got them to speak about their lineage, simple as that. On the basis that Germany had faced its own past and Russia has never faced its own past, which is a fantastically interesting idea. Whether I can get the general public here, though, to engage in that, I don't know. Perhaps the BBC can, in radio terms, where they have different outlets. I'm looking at it, particularly, funnily enough, the play that we have seen tonight, because it has a absurdist quality which does quite easily fit both a Europeanized history of the way of telling stories and the way in which we are now in this country also engaging in a certain kind of absurdism. The short answer is, I don't know.
Yes.
Can I address a question to you, John? James Thacker, I worked with human rights in the Soviet period for 18 years, actually. And I remember what it was like. I did it as a writer. Most of the people who were Americans were intelligence people, and I never met them. And I was completely, it was a very long, lonely time. And I've been on Voice of Russia Radio 6 times over the last year, and the ex-director of it was here last night, actually. And when I did this as human rights again, when I was speaking to Ken Roth out of Human Rights Watch, we collaborated on this. He went on RT. They broadcast him outside Russia, but not inside Russia. Mm-hmm. I'm just fascinated that you, an American, an eloquent American, speaking completely openly, are in the Moscow Times. And how can you be in the center of all this? I mean, I find it, maybe to you it's very normal and seems ordinary. Do they think you're Russian? I mean, how have you managed to survive in the center of all this thing? I mean, to me, it's just seems incredible,
that's another really long story. But I will say that the KGB, it was still the KGB at that time. I don't think it was the FSB yet. When I moved there, they very quickly showed up. And within the first year of my living there, our apartment was bugged, our telephone was bugged. I was essentially kidnapped by the KGB. One day I got a telephone call from the police station. They said they had questions about what I was doing in Russia, and would you please come to the police station? And I walked into the police station. It was a huge line of people, and I was told to ignore the line and just walk in the door. And I opened up the door, and the head policeman was sitting there. His face was white as a sheet, and I realized he was not the guy I was there to see. And I looked over to the left, and there were 2 guys in suits, and I realized they were the guys I was there to see. And they put me in a car. They told me, well, now we know that your wife came over with you. They had people outside watching. And I had come with my wife. She insisted that she come along to the police station with me. And she was waiting outside. So they say, we know, I mean, they're sitting inside, and they go, we know your wife is outside waiting. Please go out and tell her that everything is fine, and that you'll be back home a little bit later on this afternoon. So I walked back, and they said, and don't tell her what we said. So I walk out, and I said, Oksana, it's the KGB, and they're going to take me somewhere. Don't worry about it. It's fine. And go home. And they indeed put me in a car, and they drove me off to, I love this, it was the Comfort Hotel. Gostinets Uyut. The Comfort Hotel, and they took me up to, there was nobody there. It was completely empty. They took me up to the 10th story. There was a great big old, the old recording machines with the, what do you call that stuff? I don't remember what it's called anymore.
Reel-to-reel tape.
Reel-to-reel tape going on in the next room, and I was, being interrogated for, okay, let's jump ahead. That happened, and there was a lot more that day, which is fun to tell, but not this late. I was called in 3 other times. Every single time I was called in, there was either a putsch or Yeltsin resigned. Every single time before there was a major change, I was called into the KGB. One of the times into Lubyanka. I've been inside Lubyanka. I've been inside the interrogation rooms in Lubyanka. I know what they look like. And believe me, the walls speak. They do. I was never afraid. I'm not afraid now. But the walls speak down there in the interrogation rooms. Ooh. Since that time, since Putin became president, I have never felt their presence. I think it's partly because they were absolutely certain that I was there to do politics, and they kept following me, and all they ever got in my conversations and everything I wrote and my letters and everything is Russian theater, Russian theater, Russian theater, because that's all I've done. I've never done any politics. Now, the next thing is that once we get to the contemporary time with the protests, the last 4 or 5 years, my wife has become very outspoken, and she's, as I pointed out, she's a well-known figure in Russia. And so, of course, we know that they are keeping tabs on us. But I think they feel comfortable with me that I'm not anything more than what I am, which is a guy that's there doing theater. I have an opinion. We keep waiting for that. We keep waiting for something to happen. I frankly think if it's a serious conversation, I think Oksana will get it. My wife Oksana will get it before I would. I think they would come to her first rather than to me. But that's just a guess. That's just my feeling. But yeah, I mean, it's the answer to your question is I don't. It's you don't know either, and I don't know either. I don't know exactly what's going on. I remember sitting in a car with one of the policemen after the second or third interrogation, and they were driving me home. And this was fascinating. Gorbachev was he wasn't around anymore, but he was still he was still somebody you talked about. Yeltsin was just beginning his term, and sitting in the back of the KGB car, the guy turns to me and says, "John, do you think we really need reforms?" And I said, "Of course you do." I said, "Who doesn't need reforms?" I said, "I'm an American. America has to be reformed all the time. Of course you need reforms."
Can I just say as a little postscript to that that even people in the security service in Russia need plays and need good drama to go and see. And one of the reasons that I thought the story around Teatr Doc was worth covering is when I found out that this guy Savostyanov, who used to be in charge of the KGB in early Yeltsin era, had resigned from so he was on some sort of intellectual property committee in the Ministry of Culture because, first of all, he was very annoyed about the condemnation of Leviathan, which had won sort of plaudits abroad, but wasn't sort of very much welcomed by Medinsky and other conservative people in the Ministry of Culture. But he thought that the treatment of Teatr Doc, this man with a KGB pedigree, was the final straw, so he quit the board. Questions? Sorry. Yeah.
If I were living in suburban Moscow or deeper into Russia, how would I be finding out about all these wonderful plays that you're telling me about? I mean, you mentioned theatre critics, but I don't see such a vibrant, much of a print culture. Where do these critics write?
Unfortunately, they don't write that much anymore. I've always said that another of the marvelous things about Russian theater is the critics have no power whatsoever. Nobody pays any attention to the critics. They never have. I've been there for 26, 27 years, and nobody's ever paid any attention to the critics. The critics have virtually no power. The critics acquire power when they get into positions where they control money, and then they can control who gets into festivals and who doesn't. That's where critics have power. But as people who write, nobody pays them any attention. So the historians, when they come back and read Russian criticism, they're going to be getting a very, very, note this, any young people that are ready to write PhD dissertations, it will be an extremely skewed view of what has actually happened. Because what actually is going on often doesn't really get picked up and isn't written about. I will then make a caveat and say Pavel Rudnev is a knight in shining armor. He is an extraordinary guy, very, very smart, he has vision. He understands where Russian theater has been, where it is, and where it's going, and he does write about it. If I were to read critics from this period, I would read virtually Rudnev and maybe one or two others, period. And of course, the death of newspapers has just thrown it into blogs. It's all on the internet now. Anybody can say what they want. We can call that democracy. We can call it what we want, but it's a mess of letters and words and sentences that are very hard to make sense out of. So it's a position of critics is a very strange one.
Any more questions? Yeah.
Hello, my name is Yelena Mikhailovskaya. I'd like to ask a question as a Russian. Why does Russia still matter to you, given that we're trying to isolate ourselves so much? And recently I watched the film The Martian. I think it was the first space movie which didn't have any Russians in. It had Chinese. So really, if you could answer that, why does it still matter to you? Why is it still interesting? I see so much programming, War and Peace is going on. on BBC, there's this wonderful theatre, and I think, Russian topic is very much alive here, and you do have new audience, this new influx of immigration, which is called Putin immigration. There was a Yeltsin immigration, Putin, and just general Soviet one. So if you could answer that, please. Thank you.
Noah, do you want to kick
Sure.
off?
I mean, whenever I go to Russia, and I feel incredibly enriched by the fact that theatre is made so differently out there. In a way it's theatre, and in a way what happens here is theatre, and there's a lot in common. But in another way, the whole system is different. There's repertory theatres, and then of course there's theatre doc, that's something quite different. But in a way, this is a completely different way of making theatre. And although some of the most progressive theatre makers in Russia really hate the repertory system, they want to dismantle it, it does give opportunities to some really great directors and artistic directors to work on shows over 6 months or 3 years, and maybe not every day, but they're rehearsing those now and again over the course of 3 years. I mean, the level of thought you can put into a production in that situation is totally different to what happens here. The fact that you're working with an ensemble, it might be the same people over 5 years, or it might be the same people over 50 years. Again, it's a different type of relationship, and I think artistically and intellectually gives you scope for other possibilities that you don't have here. So I mean, I just see very different things out there, and I feel incredibly enriched by it. And I wish that for everyone in this country, that they could see the great directors from Russia all the time, and the great playwrights from Russia all the time.
What would you say about that?
I would say, look, it's a huge, enormous country. The politics, obviously, as you can see around the world, matter enormously, and to his credit or otherwise, depending on what you think about it, Putin is determined to put Russia in the position that he and many, many Russians believe it should be. And of course, given its size and its influence, it should be. And when I go to Russia, I meet incredible talents in all sorts of different areas, but particularly in the theatre. And you look at Europe, of course, there are talents in all sorts of different countries, but in this enormous country, they come together sometimes, and you see a certain kind of thinking, a different kind of thinking certainly, but a very sophisticated country, and culturally very sophisticated.
What's the play that blew your mind the most? Is there some
of these 4 plays? Actually, I think the one we've seen tonight. I think its form is complex. It's hard to see and it's hard to get. But yes, that would be my choice, I think.
I couldn't ask Noah. That would probably be a very unfair question.
Because I'll go back and tell the writer.
Exactly, I'll be in trouble.
Any more questions?
Hi guys, my name's Alice, and I just wanted to ask a question based on what one of you guys said about Russian audiences not needing to understand as much as Western audiences, perhaps. I was just wondering whether you think that's to do with the disillusionment or the desensitized nature of politics in the country, or whether that's to do with theatre as a form in Russia.
Well, it's both. Theatre as a form has evolved as it has evolved because of the way people have lived their lives, and with certain power structures or without certain power structures, or life in Russia is complex. I mean, when, as a kind of anecdotally, let me say that when the writers of the absurd, which were pretty much exhausted in the West in the 50s and 60s, when they flooded into Russia after Perestroika, everybody was saying, "What's the big deal? Our life is a lot weirder than this." Russians' lives are weird. It's a weird. I mean, you're constantly up against paradoxes. You're up against anybody who saw the reading last night. It was last night, right? Grandchildren. The complexities of, there is no black and white, there is no yes and no. It's very, very, very complex. Therefore, people are very attuned to nuances. They're willing to follow. They expect a nuance to go somewhere. And if it hits a dead end, that's perfectly normal because you hit lots of dead ends. It's a very hard question to answer, but it's a very good question. But it's a very good one because it actually hits right at the essence of Russian culture, Russian life, and Russian art. So it's a very good one. It's a very hard one to answer, particularly in a short period of time. But I would say that you know, the strangeness of Russian life, the paradoxes, the absurdities of it all, which are normal, absolutely normal. It creates a mindset which is willing to and able and ready to go along with the unexpected. I can speak about American culture. I don't know British culture really at all. Americans believe that everything must be clear and must be explained. And I find it when I try to take Russian drama to the United States, I pull my hair out because the questions that directors and actors ask me about some of the words in the text, it's like, God, you've got to be kidding me. They want every little thing explained. A Russian will never ask questions about that kind of, never. An actor doesn't need to know that at all. They need to know the big questions. So it's a very different thing. Yeah.
Yeah.
My name is Sigrun Davidsdóttir. I'm an Icelandic journalist. First of all, to the Russian lady who was worrying about Putin isolating Russia, I think the event we have had this week is a good example of the fact that vibrant culture can't be isolated. So, you know, I think that's it's a thought-provoking thing to have experienced this. But my question is really about theater attendance. Do people actually go to the theater? Is it a vibrant part of what people talk about and what they do?
You can answer that. Take it. No, no. Okay. Yes, theaters are full. There are 115 theaters in Moscow. There's more, but there are 115. That everybody knows. Virtually all of them are full all the time, and they all play virtually every night. Russia is a theatrical country. Russians are theatrical. They're a little bit like Italians. They are theatrical. They understand the theatrical impulse. They like the theatrical impulse. It makes sense to them. Theater is a place where a young couple gets dressed up and goes out to. I mean, in the United States, no young couple wants to be cool is going to go to the theater, let alone get dressed up to do it. In Russia, the girl is going to put on her nicest dress. She's going to put on her high heels. The kid's going to put on his jacket. He's going to put on a white shirt that his mother has probably ironed. And they're going to go out and they go to the theater. And I see it all the time. It's absolutely wonderful. It is not at all what we call in American theater a blue hair audience. That's just not at all the case. It's a young audience and always is a young audience. It's Russian theater is very popular. Yeah.
I think we'll have to wind up now.
Okay.
But no,
it's a really small thing.
No,
It's a funny detail that in this country, I happen to know that when people put together theatre budgets, the Arts Council, they tend to suggest planning for a 60% audience attendance, and if it's more than that, that's good. In Russia, the artistic directors, they want 100% attendance. If it starts to fall down to sort of 90, 80, okay, it's time to cut that show from the repertoire.
And we've had 100% attendance.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah, well, thank you all very much for coming and for sticking with us during the discussion. And thank you to Noah and to Simon and to Jenny for putting on this incredible season. I wish I'd seen all 4 plays, but I feel quite lucky to have seen 2. So anyway, thanks a lot.